Welcome to another peaceful evening with whispering Sandman Stories. Tonight, we'll explore the quiet, methodical world of a young woman's journey across the Atlantic, from the rolling green hills of County Cork to the humid coastal plains of the Carolinas. Before we start, why not push the subscribe button or just the like button? Thank you. Do feel free to add a comment and let us know how to improve. And now, let the gentle rhythm of Anne Cormac's daily routines carry you into restful sleep. The Morning Rituals of County Cork. Anne Cormac's days began before dawn in the small stone cottage that her family had inhabited for 3 generations. The sound of her bare feet touching the cold slate floor, the careful way she would fold back the rough woolen blankets, the methodical process of stirring the dying embers in the hearth back to life. Each morning followed the same pattern, as predictable as the turning of the seasons. She would begin by carefully selecting 3 pieces of turf from the basket beside the fireplace. The dried peat felt rough and crumbly between her fingers, each piece chosen for its size and density. First, she would place the smallest piece directly onto the glowing coals, waiting, listening to the soft crackling as it caught fire. Then, the medium piece, positioned just so to create the proper draft. Finally, the largest piece, placed with the same deliberate care her mother had taught her years before. The process of drawing water from the well required 27 steps from her front door to the stone rim. Anne had counted them countless times during her childhood. The wooden bucket, worn smooth by generations of hands, would descend slowly into the darkness below. She would listen, always listen, for the gentle splash that told her the bucket had found its mark. The rope, rough against her palms, would be pulled hand over hand in a steady rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Back in the cottage, the water would be poured into the large iron kettle, not all at once, but in a slow, careful stream to avoid splashing the precious liquid onto the hearthstones. The kettle, blackened by years of use, would be positioned just so over the growing flames, balanced on the iron hook that her grandfather had forged with his own hands decades earlier. While waiting for the water to heat, Anne would begin the daily ritual of preparing the morning meal. Oats from the wooden barrel in the corner, measured not by sight but by feel. 1 cupped handful for each member of the family, plus 1 extra for the fairies, as her grandmother had always insisted. The oats would be inspected grain by grain, removing any bits of chaff or small stones that might have escaped the winnowing process. The wooden spoon, carved from ashwood and worn smooth by constant use, would stir the oats in slow, clockwise circles. Always clockwise. Her mother was very particular about this, explaining that stirring against the sun's path would bring bad fortune to the household. The rhythm was hypnotic. Scrape against the bottom of the pot, lift, stir, scrape again, each motion flowing into the next like waves lapping against the shore. The texture of daily labour. Anne's hands told the story of her life through their calluses and scars. The spinning wheel in the corner of the main room required her attention for hours each day. The steady rhythm of the wheel turning, the gentle pull of wool fibres stretching into thread. Her right foot would work the treadle in a constant, measured beat. Press down, release, press down, release, while her fingers guided the wool with infinite patience. The wool itself came from their small flock of sheep that grazed on the hillside behind the cottage. Each sheep had its own personality, its own particular way of moving, its own preferred spot for grazing. Anne knew them all by the sound of their breathing, the particular cadence of their steps, the unique texture of their fleece. Shearing time came twice a year, a process that required careful preparation and methodical execution. First, the sheep would be gathered in the small stone pen that her father had built years before. Each animal would be approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones, allowing it to become accustomed to human presence before any attempt was made to begin the shearing process. The large scissors, kept sharp through careful maintenance, would make their first cut along the belly, always starting in the same place, following the same pattern that had been passed down through generations. The wool would fall away in long, continuous strips if the work was done properly. Anne had learned to feel for the natural separation between the fleece and the sheep's skin, never cutting too deep, never rushing the process. Each snip of the scissors was deliberate and purposeful, guided by years of practice and an intimate understanding of the animal's comfort and safety.
After shear, the wool would be spread out on wooden racks to dry in the sun. The fibres needed to be turned regularly, examined for any imperfections, sorted by quality and colour. Anne's fingers would work through each handful of wool, feeling for burrs or tangles, removing any vegetation that might have become caught in the fleece during the sheep's wanderings across the hillside. The washing process came next, a ritual that involved heating large cauldrons of water over an open fire in the yard. The wool would be immersed slowly, stirred gently with a long wooden paddle, lifted and lowered in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Too much agitation would cause the fibres to mat together. Too little would leave them dirty and unsuitable for spinning. The rhythm of seasonal changes. Autumn in County Cork arrived not with dramatic fanfare, but with subtle shifts that Anne noticed in her daily routines. The morning air carried a different quality, cooler against her skin as she made her way to the well, requiring an extra shawl wrapped carefully around her shoulders. The light too had changed, arriving later each morning and departing earlier each evening, casting longer shadows across the cottage floor. The apple trees in the small orchard behind the house required careful attention during harvest time. Each apple would be examined individually, tested for ripeness by the gentle pressure of Anne's thumb against the skin, the way it gave slightly when perfectly ready, the particular sound it made when tapped with a fingernail. The bruised or damaged fruit would be set aside for immediate use, while the perfect specimens would be wrapped individually in soft cloth and stored in the root cellar. The root cellar itself was a marvel of practical engineering, dug deep into the hillside, lined with stones that her father had carefully selected and fitted together without mortar. The temperature remained constant throughout the seasons, cool enough to prevent spoilage, warm enough to prevent freezing. The shelves built from thick oak planks were arranged to allow proper air circulation around the stored food. Preparing vegetables for winter storage was a process that began in late summer and continued well into autumn. Turnips would be pulled from the ground when the soil was neither too wet nor too dry, cleaned of dirt with a soft brush, their tops trimmed to exactly 2 inches above the root. Each turnip would be inspected for signs of damage or disease, only the perfect specimen selected for long-term storage. Potatoes required even greater care, harvested on dry days when the soil crumbled easily, lifted gently from the earth to avoid bruising the tender skin. Anne would sort them by size, the largest for immediate consumption, the medium-sized for winter meals, the smallest saved for next spring's planting. Each potato would be cleaned with a damp cloth, dried thoroughly in the sun, then stored in shallow baskets lined with straw. The preserving of meat for winter was perhaps the most critical task of the season. When a pig was slaughtered, every part of the animal would be used, nothing wasted, everything transformed through careful processing into food that would sustain the family through the cold months ahead. The salting process required precise measurements, coarse salt rubbed into every surface of the meat, packed carefully around each piece, weighted down with heavy stones to press out moisture. The patterns of village life. Market day in the nearby village of Ballycotton followed a rhythm as predictable as the tides. Anne would begin her preparations the evening before, selecting the eggs that would make the journey in her basket, each one carefully examined for cracks, wrapped in soft straw, arranged so that none would jostle against another during the walk. The butter, churned fresh the day before, would be shaped into precise 1-pound blocks, wrapped in clean linen, kept cool in the stone dairy until departure time. The walk to market covered exactly 2 miles of winding county road, past Mrs. O'Sullivan's cottage with its distinctive blue-painted door, over the stone bridge that spanned Murphy's Creek, through the gap in the stone wall where generations of travellers had worn a smooth path. Anne's feet knew every stone, every pothole, every rise and dip in the familiar route. In the market square, Anne would claim the same spot her mother had used for years, a corner position near the old oak tree that provided shade in summer and shelter from rain in winter. The wooden crate that served as her display counter would be positioned just so, level and stable on the uneven cobblestones, covered with a white cloth that had been starched and ironed to crisp perfection. The arrangement of goods followed the pattern established through years of experience. Eggs in the front, where customers could easily see their perfect shells and rich yellow yolks. Butter to the left, protected from direct sunlight by the shadow of the oak tree. Vegetables arranged by colour and size, creating an appealing display that caught the eye of passing shoppers. Conversation with customers followed its own ritualised patterns. Inquiries about family health, comments on the weather, discussions of local news and gossip, all conducted in the lilting cadence of the local dialect. Prices were rarely mentioned directly, instead negotiated through a subtle dance of suggestion and counter-suggestion, a game that both buyer and seller understood and enjoyed. The counting of money at day's end was a solemn ritual. Each coin would be examined carefully, tested by its weight and sound, sorted by denomination into neat piles. The worn leather purse that belonged to Anne's grandmother would receive the day's earnings, the coins settling with a satisfying weight against her hip for the journey home. The pool of distant shores. News of opportunities in the American colonies reached County Cork through letters read aloud in the village pub, through stories told by sailors in the harbour, through whispered conversations between neighbours who had heard rumours of land available for the taking and work that paid wages beyond imagination. Anne would listen to these stories with the part of her mind that had always wondered what lay beyond the horizon, beyond the familiar routines of cottage and field and market square. The decision to emigrate was made not in a moment of passion, but through weeks of careful consideration. Anne would lie awake at night, listening to the familiar sounds of wind through the thatch, rain against the small windows, her father's steady breathing from the next room, wondering if she would ever hear these sounds again. The pros and cons were weighed as carefully as grain at market, each argument examined from every angle, each possibility considered in minute detail. Letters from distant cousins who had made the journey years before provided practical information about the passage, the cost of fare, the conditions aboard ship, the items that should be packed and those that should be left behind. Anne would read and reread these letters, memorizing every detail, imagining herself in similar circumstances, trying to prepare her mind for experiences that lay completely outside her previous understanding.
The preparation for departure required months of careful planning. Clothes would be mended and reinforced to withstand the rigors of the journey. Worn items discarded in favour of those that would last. The small wooden chest that would hold all her worldly possessions was examined for soundness, its hinges oiled, its lock tested repeatedly to ensure it would protect her belongings during the long voyage. Saying goodbye to familiar places became a ritual in itself. Anne would visit each location that held particular meaning. The spot by the creek where she had played as a child, the grove of rowan trees where she had often gone to think, the small stone bridge where she had shared her first kiss. Each visit was a deliberate act of memory-making, an attempt to carry these places with her across the ocean. The final night in the cottage was spent in careful observation of details that had been overlooked for years. The particular way moonlight fell across the kitchen floor, the sound of mice moving in the walls, the feel of her childhood bed beneath her body, the smell of peat smoke that had permeated every wooden beam and stone surface. These sensations were catalogued carefully, stored away like precious treasures against the day when memory would be all that remained of home. The methodical process of ocean crossing. The journey to Cork Harbour required careful timing to match the sailing schedule of merchant vessels bound for Charleston. Anne's few possessions were packed into the wooden chest with mathematical precision, each item wrapped in oiled cloth, arranged to prevent shifting during the voyage, secured with rope that had been knotted and re-knotted to ensure nothing would be lost to the ship's constant motion. The ship itself, when first glimpsed from the harbour, seemed impossibly large and yet frighteningly small for the vast ocean it would cross. Anne would walk the length of the dock, studying every detail of the vessel that would be her home for the next 6 to 8 weeks, noting the thickness of the masts, the complexity of the rigging, the way the hull sat in the water under the weight of cargo and provisions. Boarding required careful navigation of a narrow gangplank that swayed with the ship's movement. Anne would grip the rope railings, feeling the hemp fibres rough against her pans, placing each foot deliberately on the wooden planks that had been worn smooth by countless passengers before her. The smell of tar and salt water and human sweat would assault her senses, a preview of conditions that would become oppressively familiar during the weeks ahead. The passenger accommodations in the ship's hold were arranged with ruthless efficiency.
wooden bunks stacked 3 high, each measuring exactly 6 feet by 2 feet, separated by narrow aisles that allowed minimal movement when the space was fully occupied. Anne's assigned bunk was examined carefully, the straw mattress tested for lumps and dampness, the wooden frame checked for splinters that might tear clothing or skin during the restless nights ahead. Daily life aboard ship followed routines dictated by necessity and the limitations of space. Fresh water was distributed twice a day, measured precisely in tin cups, each passenger allotted exactly 1 pint for drinking and washing combined. This careful rationing of this precious liquid would govern every decision about personal hygiene, every choice between thirst and cleanliness, every drop conserved against the possibility of storms that might delay their arrival. Meals consisted of hardtack and salt pork, supplemented occasionally by rice or dried peas, prepared in large cauldrons on deck and distributed in wooden bowls that passengers were expected to clean and maintain themselves. Anne would examine each piece of hardtack for signs of weevils, tap it against the ship's rail to dislodge any insects, soak it in water or weak tea to soften its rock-hard consistency enough to make chewing possible.
The gradual adaptation to Carolina soil. The Charleston harbour, when it finally appeared on the horizon after 7 weeks at sea, seemed like a mirage shimmering in the humid morning air. Anne would stand at the ship's rail, gripping the worn wood with hands that had grown thin during the voyage, watching the details of her new homeland resolve slowly from distant shapes into recognizable buildings and wharves and the movement of people going about their daily business. The process of disembarkation was conducted with the same methodical precision that had governed life aboard ship. Passengers were called by name from a written list, each person's belongings checked against an inventory, questions asked about destination and sponsors and plans for employment. Anne would wait her turn in the slowly moving line, observing the interaction between officials and immigrants, preparing her own answers to questions she could anticipate. The heat of the Carolina summer struck her like a physical blow after the cool dampness of the ship's hold. The air itself seemed thick enough to chew, laden with moisture and unfamiliar scents, the smell of magnolia blossoms and rice fields, and something else she could not identify, but would later learn was the distinctive aroma of the tidal marshes that surrounded the city. Finding lodging required a careful balance between economy and safety. Anne would walk the streets near the harbour, examining the external condition of boarding houses, noting the cleanliness of windows and doorsteps, listening to the sounds that emerged from within, judging the character of establishments by details that had served her well in choosing market stalls and business partners back in Ireland. The room she finally selected was on the 3rd floor of a narrow building that housed other recent immigrants. The walls were thin enough that conversations in adjacent rooms were clearly audible. The floors creaked with every footstep. The single window provided minimal ventilation in the oppressive heat. Yet
the bedding was clean, the landlady seemed honest, and the price was within the carefully calculated budget that would need to sustain her until employment could be found. Adaptation to the climate required gradual adjustments to clothing and daily routines. The heavy woolen garments that had provided essential warmth in Ireland became instruments of torture in the Carolina humidity. Anne would observe local women, noting their choice of fabrics, the looseness of their clothing, the way they moved more slowly during the hottest parts of the day, learning through careful attention to modify her own behaviour accordingly. The rhythm of new beginnings. Employment as a seamstress in a dress shop on King Street provided Anne with her first regular income in the new world. The work required skills that translated directly from her experience with spinning and weaving. Though the fabrics were finer, the techniques more elaborate, the expectations of customers far more demanding than anything she had encountered in the simple rural economy of County Cork. The shop itself was a revelation in organisation and efficiency. Bolts of fabric arranged by colour and weight, threads sorted by shade in wooden cabinets with dozens of small drawers, patterns hanging from hooks along the walls, each design carefully labelled and preserved for repeated use. Anne would spend her first weeks simply learning the location of tools and materials, memorising the system that allowed the seamstresses to work quickly and efficiently. The actual process of sewing required adjustments to techniques learned in childhood. The fine silk and cotton fabrics demanded lighter touches, more delicate handling, stitches that were smaller and more precise than those adequate for working with rough wool and linen. Anne's fingers would practice the new motions during evening hours, working on scraps of material until the movements became as automatic as the breathing patterns that sustained life. Customer fittings followed ritualised procedures that emphasised both accuracy and discretion. Measurements were taken in a specific order, recorded in a leather-bound book kept for each client, checked and double-checked to ensure perfect fit. The process of draping fabric, marking alterations, pinning adjustments, all conducted with the solemnity of a religious ceremony, each step critical to the final success of the garment. The social aspects of the work provided Anne with her first real introduction to Carolina society. Through careful listening to customer conversations, observation of their mannerisms and preferences, attention to the details of their lives that emerged during fittings, she began to understand the complex hierarchies and relationships that governed her new community. Evening hours were spent in her small room, mending her own clothes by candlelight, writing letters to family in Ireland, calculating and recalculating her finances, planning for a future that was slowly taking shape through the accumulation of small daily choices and the gradual building of new routines in a land that was becoming, slowly but steadily, something that might eventually be called home. Gentle conclusion. And so our quiet journey with Anne Cormac draws to its peaceful close, her story continuing beyond these gentle hours we've shared together, into dreams of Irish countryside and Carolina summers, of spinning wheels and sailing ships, of familiar routines giving way to new rhythms, new possibilities, new ways of being in the world. Let these images accompany you now into restful sleep, the sound of wool being spun into thread, the gentle splash of water drawn from deep wells, the whisper of wind through cottage thatch and ship's rigging alike,
carrying you toward the peaceful shores of dreams. Until we meet again for another quiet evening of Whispering Sandman Stories. Sleep well, sleep peacefully, sleep deeply.